When Elena Cross became invisible, she thought she'd finally be safe. Working as a maid in Dominic Varela's fortress-like mansion, she cleaned around dangerous men who never looked twice at the help. She'd buried her nursing career, her old name, everything that connected her to Caleb Thorne, the man who nearly destroyed her. But invisibility is an illusion in the world of crime bosses. The afternoon Dominic's associate grabbed her wrist in front of a room full of killers. Everything shattered. And when Dominic's voice cut through the chaos with four terrifying words, "Who touched you?" Elena realized she'd been seen all along. If you're hooked, stay until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Elena's journey reaches across the world. The mansion didn't have ghosts, but it had shadows that moved like them. Elena Cross had learned every corner of those shadows in the 6 months she'd worked there. She knew which hallways the guards patrolled, which rooms held meetings she should never interrupt, and which hours belonged to the kind of silence that meant dangerous men were making dangerous decisions. She'd become an expert at disappearing. It was a survival skill she'd perfected long before she ever stepped foot in Dominic Varela's world. When you spent 2 years running from a man who believed he owned you, invisibility wasn't just useful, it was essential. The mansion was her newest hiding place, though calling it a mansion felt insufficient. The estate sprawled across 12 acres of manicured grounds in the most exclusive corner of the city, surrounded by walls that could stop an army and guards who looked like they'd fought in several. Inside, marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and every room whispered wealth and power. Elena cleaned them all. She moved through the estate with her head down and her movements efficient, just another piece of furniture the men who ran empires never noticed. The other staff, mostly older women who'd worked for the Varela family for decades, had warned her during her first week. "Don't make eye contact with the associates," Maria had said, her weathered hands folding linens with practiced precision. "Don't speak unless spoken to, and absolutely never ever go anywhere near Mr. Varela's private office when he's conducting business." Elena had nodded, grateful for the rules. Rules meant structure. Structure meant predictability. And predictability meant she could stay invisible. She'd been invisible for so long now that sometimes she forgot she'd once been someone else entirely. Dr. Elena Morgan? No, she couldn't think that name anymore. That woman had died the night she'd grabbed her 9-month-old son and disappeared into a rainstorm with nothing but a hospital bag and terror in her veins. That woman had been a neonatal nurse at St. Catherine's, respected and skilled, with a promising career and a fiancé her colleagues had envied. They hadn't known what happened behind closed doors. They hadn't known about Caleb's grip on her wrist when she came home late from a difficult shift, or the way his voice could turn from charming to caustic in the space of a breath. They hadn't known about the isolated lake house where he'd started taking her on weekends, miles from anyone who might hear her scream, or the cold calculation in his eyes when he'd told her that leaving would mean losing their son forever. "I have resources you can't imagine," he'd said, his hand gentle on her face while his words carved out her future. "Lawyers, judges, people who owe me favors. You run, and I'll prove you're an unfit mother. You'll never see him again." She'd believed him. Caleb Thorne came from money, old money, the kind that built wings on hospitals and had senators on speed dial. His family's name opened doors and closed cases. Who would believe a nurse over a Thorne? But then she'd seen the bruise on her son's arm. Tiny, barely visible, probably from Caleb's grip when he'd snatched the baby from her arms during an argument. But it was enough. Enough to show her what her future looked like if she stayed. Enough to make her choose the unknown terror of running over the certain horror of remaining. So she'd run. New city, new name, new life built on minimum wage and maximum caution. The mansion job had fallen into her lap through a staffing agency that didn't ask questions if you had a clean background check. And Elena Cross's background was immaculate because she'd paid a small fortune to make sure it was. The pay was good, the hours were stable, and most importantly, it was the last place Caleb would think to look for her. Who would imagine a doctor hiding as a maid in a crime lord's house? The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fled from one dangerous man straight into the employment of another, though Dominic Varela's danger was of an entirely different species. Caleb's violence had been personal, intimate, designed to control. Dominic's reputation suggested his violence was professional, strategic, designed to rule. Elena had never met him directly. She'd seen him, of course, glimpses across vast rooms, his tall frame moving through the mansion with the kind of confidence that came from knowing every person in it would die for him if he asked. Dark hair always perfectly styled, suits that cost more than her yearly salary, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without ever appearing to look directly at anything. The staff called him Mr. Varela, always with a tone of respect that bordered on fear. The associates who came and went at all hours called him Dom or Boss, their body language shifting into something alert and careful whenever he entered a room. Elena called him nothing because she never got close enough to require speech. Until the day Marco Santini got drunk on power and made a mistake. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for the meeting happening in the West Wing conference room. Elena had been specifically told to stay away from that corridor until after 4 o'clock, which meant whatever business was being conducted required absolute privacy. She'd been in the kitchen, helping Maria prepare refreshments that would be delivered by one of the guards, when Victor, head of household security, had appeared in the doorway. "Elena, I need you to bring the coffee service to the conference room." Her hands had frozen on the tray she'd been arranging. Maria's dealing with a situation in the guest wing. You're doing it." It wasn't a request. Her heart had kicked into an uncomfortable rhythm, but she'd nodded, lifting the heavy silver tray with steady hands that betrayed none of her anxiety. Invisible people didn't argue with direct orders. The walk to the West Wing had felt longer than usual, her soft-soled shoes silent on the marble floors. She could hear voices as she approached, male, multiple, some raised in what sounded like disagreement. She'd paused outside the heavy oak doors, waiting for a lull in the conversation before knocking. "Come." The single word had been delivered in a voice she recognized from a distance, but had never heard directed at her. Deep, controlled, with an edge that suggested the speaker was accustomed to immediate obedience. Dominic Varela. She'd pushed open the door with her shoulder, keeping her eyes on the tray as she entered. The conference room was exactly what she'd expected. More marble, more crystal, a table that could seat 20 surrounded by men in expensive suits who radiated barely contained violence. "Just set it on the sideboard," someone had said. Elena had moved carefully across the room, hyper-aware of the conversations that had quieted at her entrance. She could feel eyes on her, the way predators watch prey that wanders into their territory. Her skin had prickled with awareness, but she'd kept her face neutral, her movements economical. She'd been arranging the coffee service when she'd felt it, a presence too close behind her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The voice had been oily, amused, edged with something that made her stomach turn. She'd recognized it. Marco Santini, one of Dominic's associates, a man the other staff avoided whenever possible. "Elena, sir," she'd said quietly, not turning around, hoping her deference would be enough to make him lose interest. It hadn't been. "Elena," he'd repeated, drawing out the syllables like he was tasting them. "Pretty name. You're new, aren't you? I would have remembered a face like yours." She'd felt him move closer, his breath touching her neck. Every instinct had screamed at her to move, to run. But she'd learned the hard way that running from men like this only excited them. She'd stayed frozen, her hands trembling slightly on the coffee pot. "Santini, back off." A different voice, younger, uncertain. One of the other associates may be trying to prevent a scene. "Relax, I'm just being friendly," Marco had said, and then his hand had closed around her wrist. The touch had detonated something in Elena's nervous system, pure panic, the kind that bypassed rational thought and went straight to survival instinct. For a split second, she wasn't in Dominic Varela's mansion. She was in Caleb's lake house, his fingers digging into her skin while he explained very calmly how no one would ever believe her if she told. She jerked backward, the coffee pot clattering against the tray. "Easy," Marco had laughed, his grip tightening. "I just want to let go of me." Her voice had come out stronger than she'd expected, loud enough that every conversation in the room had stopped. The silence had been absolute. Marco's face had darkened, his amusement curdling into something uglier. "You don't give me orders, sweetheart. I'm a guest in this house, and you're... Who touched you?" 3 words, delivered in a voice so cold that Elena had felt the temperature in the room drop. Marco's hand had released her wrist like she'd burned him. She'd turned, finally, and found herself looking directly at Dominic Varela for the first time. He was standing at the head of the table, perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He wasn't looking at Marco. He wasn't looking at any of the other men who'd suddenly found fascinating details to examine on the ceiling or the floor. He was looking at her wrist, where Marco's fingers had left red marks on her skin. "I asked you a question, Elena." The way he said her name, like he'd known it all along, like she'd never been invisible to him for even a moment, made something crack in her chest. She'd swallowed hard, her survival instincts warring with something else, something that whispered this was different. "I'm fine, Mr. Varela. It was just, answer the question." Not a request. A command, but not directed at her. Marco had taken a step backward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Dom, come on, it was nothing. You were just leaving," Dominic had said, his voice still carrying that terrible cold precision. Permanently. The room had gone even quieter, if that was possible. "What? Dom, we've done business for 5 years. And in 5 years, you never learned the most important rule." Dominic had moved then, crossing the room with fluid grace until he stood between Elena and Marco. "No one touches my people without permission. No one." "She's a maid," Marco had sputtered, his face reddening. "Since when do you—" "Since always." Dominic had turned slightly, addressing the room without taking his attention off Marco. "Everyone out, now." The associates had moved like a school of fish, flowing toward the door with practiced efficiency. Elena had started to follow, but a hand, gentle, nothing like Marco's grip, had touched her shoulder. "Not you." She'd frozen again, watching the last of the men file out until it was just the 3 of them, her, Dominic, and Marco, who was starting to look genuinely frightened. "Dom, please, you have 2 choices," Dominic had said conversationally. "You can walk out of this room, out of my house, and out of this city by midnight tonight. Or you can refuse, and I'll have Victor escort you out in pieces. Your choice." Marco's face had cycled through several shades of red and white. "You can't be serious. Over a fucking maid?" The change in Dominic had been subtle but terrifying. A slight tilt of his head, a fractional narrowing of his eyes. "You have 1 minute to decide. Tick-tock, Marco." Elena had watched, frozen in horrified fascination, as Marco Santini, a man who'd built an empire on intimidation, had crumbled under the weight of Dominic Varela's quiet fury. 30 seconds later, he'd stumbled toward the door, and Victor, who must have been waiting outside, had appeared to escort him out. Then they'd been alone. Dominic had turned to face her fully, and Elena had found herself caught in the full force of his attention. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, broad-shouldered in a way his tailored suits only hinted at, with a face that would have been handsome if it weren't currently arranged in an expression of such controlled intensity. "Let me see your wrist." She'd extended her arm automatically, watching as he examined the marks with a gentleness that seemed at odds with what she'd just witnessed. "I'll have Dr. Chen look at this." "It's fine," she'd managed. "Really, I've had worse." She'd cut herself off, but too late. His eyes had lifted to hers, and she'd seen something shift in them. Recognition, understanding, maybe pity. She'd hated the pity most of all. "I know," he'd said quietly. 2 words that had made her blood run cold. "I'm sorry?" "I know who you are, Elena. Or should I say, Dr. Morgan." The floor had seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Don't lie to me." Still gentle, but with steel underneath. "I've known since the day you applied for the position. Neonatal nurse at St. Catherine's, graduated top of your class from Columbia, engaged to Caleb Thorne until you disappeared 18 months ago with your son." She'd felt the walls closing in, her carefully constructed new life crumbling around her. "I'm very good at knowing who's in my house," Dominic had said. "The question is why a skilled doctor is scrubbing my floors, and why she looks terrified every time a man raises his voice." Elena's throat had closed up entirely. This was it. He'd tell Caleb. Men like Dominic knew men like Caleb. They moved in the same circles of power and privilege. One phone call and everything would be over. "Please," she'd whispered, hating the weakness in her voice but unable to stop it. "Please don't tell him where I am. I'll leave tonight. I'll disappear. Just please, breathe, Elena." The command had cut through her panic, sharp enough to make her obey. She'd sucked in air, her hands shaking. "I'm not going to tell him anything," Dominic had continued, his voice returning to that careful gentleness. What I am going to do is make sure what happened with Santini never happens again. From this moment forward, you're under my protection. She'd stared at him, trying to understand. Why? Because I don't tolerate abuse in my house. Because you're skilled at something that matters, saving children's lives. And that deserves respect. And because he'd paused, something complicated crossing his features. Because I know what it's like to run from someone who thinks they own you. The confession had hung in the air between them, unexpected and oddly intimate. I don't understand what this means, Elena had said finally. Your protection. It means you work directly for me now. No more cleaning staff duties. I have a proposal for you, but you're in shock right now, and I don't do business with people who can't think clearly. He gestured toward the door. Take the rest of the day off. Tomorrow morning, come to my office. We'll talk. And if I run? The question had slipped out before she could stop it. Dominic had smiled then, a slight curve of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes. Then you run. I won't stop you. But Caleb Thorne is looking for you, Elena. His family has hired investigators, offered rewards. It's only a matter of time before someone recognizes you. He'd paused. Unless you have protection, he can't break through. Her heart had hammered against her ribs. What do you want in return? Tomorrow, he'd said. 10 a.m. Think about whether you want to keep running forever or whether you're ready to stop. He'd left her standing there in the conference room, her wrist still aching from Marco's grip, her mind reeling from the revelation that her invisibility had been an illusion all along. That night, Elena hadn't slept. She'd stood in the small room she shared with her son in the staff quarters, watching him sleep in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with the perfect rhythm of innocence. Lucas, 18 months old, with her eyes and unfortunately his father's dark hair. The most beautiful thing she'd ever created and the most terrifying responsibility she'd ever carried. She'd thought about running. She'd gotten good at it. She had emergency funds, fake documents, a plan for disappearing that she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head. But Dominic's words kept echoing in her mind. It's only a matter of time before someone recognizes you. She'd known it was true. She'd felt it in her bones for months now, the sense that her borrowed time was running out. Every stranger who looked at her too long, every unexpected phone call, every moment of déjà vu when she thought she'd seen someone from her old life, it all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. Caleb would find her eventually, and when he did, she'd lose Lucas forever. Unless she had protection, he couldn't break through. At 9:55 the next morning, Elena had knocked on the door of Dominic Varela's private office. Come in. She'd entered to find him seated behind a massive desk, the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate grounds. He'd been reading something on his tablet, but he'd set it aside when she entered, giving her his full attention. You came. You knew I would. I hoped you would. There's a difference. He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Sit, please. She'd sat, her posture rigid, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them from shaking. I'm going to be direct with you, Dominic had begun. Caleb Thorne is escalating his search. 2 days ago, one of his investigators was in the city, showing your photo to staffing agencies. He hasn't found you yet, but he's getting closer. The confirmation of her worst fears had made her stomach drop. How do you know this? Because I make it my business to know what threats are moving toward my people. The moment you walked into my house, you became my responsibility. He'd leaned forward slightly. Elena, you need more than a new name and a service entrance to hide behind. You need power. The kind of power that makes men like Caleb Thorne think twice. And you have that power. I do. She'd met his eyes, searching for the trap she knew had to be there. Men like Dominic Varela didn't offer protection out of pure altruism. What do you want from me? I want you to be exactly what Marco Santini accused you of being yesterday. At her confused expression, he'd continued, I want you to be mine, publicly, obviously, in a way that makes it impossible for Caleb to touch you without going through me first. Her breath had caught. You want me to be my partner, my companion, the woman by my side at events and in public, the person this entire city believes I'm with. Why? The question had come out as barely more than a whisper. You could have anyone. Why would you want? Because I don't want anyone, Elena. That's the point. He'd stood, moving to the window, his profile sharp against the light. I'm 34 years old. I run an organization that requires absolute loyalty and zero distractions. Every time I attend a business function or a charity gala, I'm surrounded by people trying to offer me their daughters, their sisters, their nieces. They think a wife would make me more stable, more predictable. Would it? He'd smiled slightly. No, but it would make them stop trying, and more importantly, it would give you exactly what you need: legal protection, social standing, and a shield that Caleb Thorne's family money can't penetrate. Elena had tried to process what he was proposing. You want a fake relationship. I want a mutually beneficial arrangement. You get protection for yourself and your son. I get peace from matchmaking socialites and a companion who understands that this is business, not romance. And if I say no, then I'll help you run farther and faster than you could on your own. But eventually Caleb will find you, Elena. Men like him don't stop. Dominic had turned back to face her. Or you can stop running and start living. Under my protection, in my home, with resources at your disposal that Caleb can't match. She'd thought about Lucas sleeping peacefully in a borrowed crib in a borrowed room, unaware that his entire future was being decided in this moment. What would this arrangement entail, specifically? You'd move into the main house. You and Lucas would have a suite of rooms, private, secure. You'd attend events with me as my partner, play the role in public. In private, your time is your own. No expectations beyond maintaining the appearance. And my son? Protected. Always. I'll have a security detail assigned to him specifically. The best nannies money can buy, education, healthcare, everything he needs. It had sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. There has to be more. What aren't you telling me? Dominic had moved back to his desk, bracing his hands on it as he leaned forward. I'm telling you that accepting my protection means entering my world completely. The people I do business with are dangerous, Elena. The life I lead isn't safe. I can protect you from Caleb, but I can't protect you from the reality of who I am and what I do. You're a criminal. I'm a businessman who operates outside conventional legal structures. He'd corrected, a hint of dark humor in his voice. But yes, if you want to use simple terms, I'm a criminal. And associating with me, even in a fake relationship, will put you in proximity to other criminals, to violence, to moral complexity you probably never wanted to confront. She'd sat there, weighing her options. Run and eventually lose everything. Or stay and trade one form of danger for another. But the danger Dominic represented came with power, with protection, with a chance for Lucas to grow up safe. If I do this, she'd said slowly, I need guarantees. Legal documentation that Lucas is mine. Protection that doesn't disappear if you get bored with this arrangement. You'll have both. I'll have my lawyers draw up an agreement, everything in writing. And when it ends, because this kind of thing always ends. Dominic's expression had shifted into something she couldn't quite read. When it ends, you'll walk away with enough resources to start over anywhere in the world. You have my word. Why should I trust your word? Because unlike Caleb Thorne, I keep my promises. He'd extended his hand across the desk. Do we have a deal, Dr. Morgan? She'd stared at his hand for a long moment, knowing that taking it would change everything. Then she'd thought about the bruise on Lucas's arm and Caleb's cold certainty that he would win and the endless exhaustion of running. Elena had reached out and clasped Dominic's hand. We have a deal, Mr. Varela. His grip had been firm, warm, and for just a moment, his expression had softened into something that might have been respect. Call me Dominic. We're partners now. The word had felt strange on her tongue, but she'd nodded. She'd made a deal with a crime lord to escape a monster, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice had whispered that she'd just traded one cage for another. But this cage, at least, came with protection. This cage came with power. And for the first time in 2 years, Elena Cross, Dr. Elena Morgan, had felt something other than fear. She'd felt hope, even if it was the dangerous kind. The transformation happened faster than Elena had anticipated. Within 48 hours of shaking Dominic's hand, her entire world had been dismantled and reconstructed. The small room in the staff quarters became a memory, replaced by a suite on the mansion's 3rd floor that was larger than the apartment she'd shared with Caleb. 3 rooms, A bedroom with a king-size bed she could get lost in, a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, and a nursery for Lucas that looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Maria had helped her move her meager possessions, the older woman's face carefully neutral as she carried boxes up the main staircase instead of the service entrance Elena had always used. "The staff is talking," Maria had said quietly as she unpacked Lucas's clothes into a dresser that probably cost more than Elena's car. "I know. They're saying you seduced Mr. Varela." Elena had looked up from where she was arranging Lucas's toys, meeting Maria's eyes. "And what do you think?" The older woman had been quiet for a moment, her weathered hand smoothing a baby blanket with practiced care. "I think Mr. Varela doesn't do anything without a reason, and I think you look less afraid than you did yesterday." It was true. The constant knot of anxiety that had lived in Elena's chest for 18 months had loosened slightly, replaced by a different kind of tension, the awareness that she'd stepped into a role she barely understood, with stakes she was still calculating. That first evening in her new suite, Dominic had knocked on her door at precisely 7 o'clock. She'd opened it to find him changed from his usual suit into dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that made him look somehow more dangerous in its casualness. "Dinner," he'd said simply. "My private dining room. We need to discuss logistics." She'd followed him through corridors she'd only ever cleaned, hyper-aware of how different they looked from this perspective, as a guest rather than invisible help. The private dining room was smaller than the formal one she'd seen during events, intimate in a way that made her nervous. A table set for two, candles already lit, and windows that showed the city lights beginning to sparkle in the distance. "Sit," Dominic had said, pulling out a chair for her with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed at odds with everything else about him. She'd sat, watching as he moved to the sidebar where wine was already breathing. "I don't drink." "Because you don't want to, or because Caleb didn't let you?" The question had been delivered casually, but it had hit like a physical blow. Elena had gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself to breathe through the surge of memories. "How much do you know about him?" "Everything." Dominic had poured himself a glass of red wine, then brought her water instead, setting it down gently beside her plate. "I don't enter into arrangements without complete information. Caleb Thorne, 32, heir to the Thorne pharmaceutical fortune. Princeton educated, Harvard Law. On paper, he's perfect. Charitable donations, hospital boards, political connections. And off paper? 3 restraining orders from previous girlfriends, all settled quietly with money. A sealed juvenile record that cost his family a fortune to bury. And a pattern of behavior that suggests he views women as possessions rather than people." Dominic had sat across from her, his dark eyes steady. "He won't let you go easily, Elena. Men like him don't understand the word no." "I know." Her voice had come out smaller than she'd intended. "That's why I ran." "Tell me about the night you left." She'd stared at her water glass, watching condensation bead on the crystal. No one had asked her about that night. She'd buried it deep, refused to let herself think about it because thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant falling apart. "Lucas was 9 months old," she'd begun, the words coming slowly. "I was working the late shift at the hospital. There was a premature baby, 26 weeks, and she was crashing. I stayed 3 hours past my shift trying to stabilize her." She'd paused, remembering the tiny chest under her hands, the frantic beeping of monitors. "I saved her life. And when I got home at 2 in the morning, exhausted and still in my scrubs, Caleb was waiting." Dominic hadn't interrupted, just watched her with that intense focus that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe. "He said I was choosing work over family, that I was neglecting our son to play hero with other people's children. I tried to explain, but he—" Her voice had cracked. "He grabbed Lucas out of his crib, held him in a way that wasn't gentle, and I saw the bruise the next morning. That's when you knew." "That's when I knew that if I stayed, he'd hurt our son to control me. So that night, during his weekly poker game with his friends, I packed a hospital bag, took Lucas, and disappeared." The admission had hung in the air between them, heavy with everything she hadn't said. The terror of that rainy drive to nowhere, the weeks of sleeping in her car, the slow construction of a new identity built on cash and caution. "You were brave," Dominic had said finally. "I was desperate. Bravery and desperation often look the same. He'd taken a sip of his wine. But that's over now. From this moment forward, Caleb Thorne becomes my problem, not yours. Elena had wanted to believe him, but belief required trust, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. What exactly does that mean? It means that starting tomorrow, you and I are going to become very public. I'm hosting a charity gala this weekend. 500 guests, major donors, the kind of event that makes the society pages. You'll attend as my companion. Her stomach had dropped. This weekend? That's too fast. I don't know how to... You'll learn. I'm having a stylist come tomorrow to work with you. Hair, makeup, wardrobe, everything you need to look the part. The part of what exactly? Your mistress? Dominic's expression had shifted into something that might have been amusement. My partner. There's a difference. A mistress is hidden, shameful. A partner stands beside me publicly, acknowledged, and protected. And what do I have to do to earn that protection? Be convincing. When we're in public, you're mine. You stand close, you smile when appropriate, you let me touch you in ways that suggest intimacy. The clinical description of physical intimacy had made her skin prickle with awareness. Define touch. Nothing sexual. A hand at your back, fingers laced with yours, an arm around your waist. The kind of casual contact couples share. He'd paused, his gaze sharpening. But I won't touch you without warning, Elena. And if something makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. This arrangement only works if you trust me enough to communicate. She'd studied him across the table, trying to reconcile the man who'd destroyed Marco Santini's career over a grabbed wrist with the crime lord who expected her to play pretend as his lover. Why do I get the feeling you're not telling me everything? Because I'm not. Dominic had set down his wine glass. The gala this weekend isn't just social. Caleb Thorne's family will be there. The room had tilted. What? The Thornes are major donors to the Children's Hospital Foundation I support. They attend every year, which means Caleb will be there. Elena had stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Are you insane? If he sees me, he'll see you on my arm, wearing a fortune in jewelry, protected by my reputation. Dominic had remained seated, maddeningly calm. And he'll understand that you're untouchable now. Or he'll make a scene, or worse, he won't. The certainty in Dominic's voice had stopped her panic mid-spiral. Because making a scene means drawing attention. And the moment Caleb draws attention to you, I draw attention to him. His family's carefully cultivated image, his sealed records, his history of abuse, all of it becomes public knowledge. Elena had gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. You'd destroy him? Without hesitation, but only if he forces my hand. Dominic had stood then, moving around the table until he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. This is why I need you to trust me, Elena. Facing Caleb this weekend will be terrifying, but it's also necessary. Right now, he's hunting you in the shadows. We're going to drag everything into the light. And if he tries to take Lucas? He won't get within 10 feet of your son. I'm assigning a dedicated security team to Lucas, former Special Forces, the best money can buy. And during the gala, Lucas will be here, in this house, behind walls that would take an army to breach. She'd searched his face for signs of deception, for the trap she still believed had to exist. Why are you doing this? Really? Dominic had been quiet for a moment, something complicated shifting across his features. Because I watched my mother spend 20 years afraid of my father. She was brilliant, a concert pianist before she married him. But he wanted a wife who stayed home, who lived small, who never outshone him. So she made herself small, and it killed something essential in her. His voice had gone rough. She died when I was 19. Heart attack, officially. But I think it was really just exhaustion from being afraid all the time. The confession had landed between them, raw and unexpected. I'm sorry, Elena had whispered. Don't be sorry. Be ready. He'd stepped back, the momentary vulnerability sliding behind his usual controlled mask. This weekend, we show Caleb Thorne that you're not his to hunt anymore. Can you do that? Elena had thought about Lucas sleeping peacefully in the nursery down the hall, protected by walls and guards, and a man who understood what it meant to watch someone you loved live in fear. Yes, she'd said, I can do that. The next 3 days had been a whirlwind of preparation that left Elena's head spinning. The stylist Dominic had promised turned out to be three people: a fashion consultant named Vera, who dressed celebrities, a makeup artist who worked on magazine covers, and a hair specialist who took one look at Elena's dye job and winced. "We're going back to your natural color," the hair specialist Antoine had declared. "If we're making you visible, we're doing it right." Elena had sat in a chair in her suite while they worked their magic, transforming her from invisible to undeniable. When they'd finally let her look in the mirror, she'd barely recognized herself. Her natural honey blonde hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders. Her skin glowed with subtle makeup that enhanced rather than masked. And the dress Vera had selected, a deep emerald silk that hugged her curves before flowing to the floor, made her look like someone who belonged in Dominic's world. "Perfect," Vera had pronounced. "You look like power in a pretty package." Elena had touched the delicate diamond necklace at her throat, on loan from Dominic's collection, worth more than she'd earned in 5 years of nursing. "I look like I'm playing dress-up." "Good. That's what every woman in that ballroom will think right up until they see the way Dominic looks at you. Then they'll know you're the real thing." Except it wasn't real. None of it was real. But Elena had nodded anyway, practicing her smile in the mirror until it looked natural instead of terrified. The night of the gala, Dominic had knocked on her door at 7:30. She'd opened it to find him in a tuxedo that had probably been custom made, his dark hair perfectly styled, every inch the powerful man the world believed him to be. His eyes had swept over her, and something had flickered in their depths, surprise maybe, or appreciation. "You look extraordinary." "Vera's work, not mine." "No." He'd stepped closer, and she'd caught the scent of his cologne, something subtle and expensive. "Vera enhanced what was already there. You've been hiding for so long, you forgot what you look like when you're not trying to disappear." The observation had been too accurate, too knowing. Elena had busied herself with adjusting her clutch to avoid meeting his eyes. "Are you ready?" he'd asked. "No, but I don't think I ever will be, so let's go before I lose my nerve." Dominic had offered his arm, the gesture formal and steadying. "Remember, you're not alone in this. I'll be beside you the entire night." She'd taken his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of expensive fabric. "And if I see Caleb?" "You smile, you hold your head high, and you let me handle the rest." The gala was being held in the mansion's grand ballroom, a space Elena had cleaned 100 times but never seen like this, transformed by thousands of flowers, crystal chandeliers blazing with light, and an orchestra playing soft classical music. 500 guests in designer gowns and tuxedos mingled beneath soaring ceilings, their laughter and conversation creating a sophisticated hum. The moment Elena entered on Dominic's arm, conversation stopped. She'd felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward them, assessing, judging, speculating. Her instinct screamed to run, to hide, to become invisible again. But Dominic's hand had covered hers where it rested on his arm, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like an anchor. "Breathe," he'd murmured, "and follow my lead." He'd guided her into the crowd with the ease of a man who'd attended 1,000 such events. People had approached them immediately: business associates, social climbers, wealthy donors who wanted Dominic's attention. He'd introduced her simply, consistently, his message clear. "This is Elena, my partner. Not girlfriend, not companion, partner." The word carried weight in Dominic's world, conferring status and protection in equal measure. Elena had smiled and made small talk, playing the role Dominic needed while her mind catalogued every face, searching for the one she dreaded seeing. An hour passed, then two. The champagne flowed, the orchestra played, and Elena began to think maybe Caleb wouldn't show. Then she'd seen him. He was across the ballroom, standing with an older couple who had to be his parents, the famous Thorne family, hospital benefactors and pharmaceutical dynasty. Caleb looked exactly as she remembered, perhaps a bit thinner, his dark hair styled perfectly, his smile charming as he spoke to a congressman's wife. He looked harmless, normal, like the man she'd once believed she loved. Elena's chest had constricted, her breathing going shallow. "I see him," Dominic had said quietly, his hand moving to the small of her back. "Look at me, Elena." She'd torn her gaze from Caleb, meeting Dominic's eyes instead. "You're safe," he'd said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He can't hurt you here. Do you believe me? She'd wanted to. She'd nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Now we're going to walk over there, and you're going to show him exactly what he lost when you chose freedom over his cage. Every instinct had screamed against it, but Elena had let Dominic guide her through the crowd, her hand gripping his arm like a lifeline. As they'd approached, she'd seen the moment Caleb noticed them, his polite smile freezing, his eyes widening in recognition, and then narrowing in something uglier. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, Dominic had greeted the older couple with practiced charm. Thank you for your continued support of the foundation. Of course, Mr. Varela, Mrs. Thorne had replied, her society smile fixed in place. We're always happy to support children's health initiatives. And who is this lovely young woman? Elena Cross, Dominic had said, his hand still steady at Elena's back. My partner. Elena had seen the exact moment Caleb had placed her face with the new hair, the expensive dress, the woman she'd become. His expression had gone through shock, disbelief, and fury in rapid succession. Elena? His voice had been too loud, drawing attention from nearby guests. What the hell are you? I'm sorry, have we met? Elena had heard herself say, her voice steadier than she'd felt. The lie had been Dominic's idea, deny any prior connection, make Caleb look unstable if he pushed. Met? Caleb's face had reddened. You're my… Careful, Dominic had interrupted, his tone still pleasant but carrying an edge that made Caleb stop mid-sentence. I believe you're confusing my partner with someone else. Easy mistake. Elena has one of those faces. The casual dismissal had been perfectly calculated. Either Caleb could back down and look foolish, or push forward and make a scene that would raise questions about why he was so fixated on a woman who claimed not to know him. I'm not confused, Caleb had ground out, his control slipping. She's having a lovely evening, Dominic had finished smoothly. As are we all. Please excuse us. I've been neglecting Elena shamefully, and I owe her a dance. He'd guided Elena away before Caleb could respond, his hand firm and steady as he led her toward the dance floor. The orchestra had been playing a waltz, and Dominic had pulled her into his arms with the kind of practiced ease that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. You're shaking, he'd observed quietly as they'd begun to move. He looked at me like… Her voice had broken. Like he still owned you, I know. Dominic had pulled her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers in a grip that was gentle but grounding. But he doesn't, Elena. Look around this room. What do you see? She'd glanced past his shoulder, taking in the other dancers, the watching crowd. People staring at us. They're watching me dance with my partner. They're seeing Dominic Varela, one of the most powerful men in this city, choose you. In this world, that means something. It means you're protected, valued, untouchable. It's all pretend, she'd whispered. Is it? His dark eyes had held hers. The protection is real, Elena. The resources are real. The fact that Caleb can't get within 10 feet of you without going through me first, that's very real. The waltz had continued, and Elena had let herself lean into Dominic's strength, her forehead nearly touching his shoulder. Around them, the ballroom had blurred into soft light and music. And for just a moment, she'd let herself believe that this could work, that she could actually be safe. The moment had shattered when Caleb had appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. We need to talk, he'd demanded, reaching for Elena's arm. Dominic had moved so fast, Elena barely saw it. One moment they'd been dancing, the next he'd positioned himself between her and Caleb, his hand catching Caleb's wrist before it could touch her. I don't think so, Dominic had said, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous. Get your hands off me, Caleb had snarled. That's my fiancé. Is it? Dominic had looked past Caleb to where a crowd was gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Because she seems to think you're a stranger. And I'm inclined to believe my partner over a man who's had too much champagne and is making wild accusations. Wild accusations? I have rights. We have a child together. The words had hung in the air, and Elena had felt the world tilt. He'd said it, in front of everyone. And now… Do you have proof of that? Dominic had asked, still calm, still controlled. Legal documentation? Custody papers? Or are you simply harassing my companion with claims you can't substantiate? Caleb's mouth had opened and closed, fury warring with calculation. They both knew he couldn't produce legal documentation, not without admitting that Elena had taken their son, and he'd never filed a missing persons report because doing so would have raised questions he didn't want answered. "I'll get proof," Caleb had spat, "and when you do, you'll go through my lawyers like a civilized person," Dominic had interrupted. "But right now, you're going to step away from my partner, apologize to Mrs. Thorne for causing a scene at her charity event, and leave. Or I'll have security escort you out and explain to everyone here why Dominic Varela had a member of the illustrious Thorne family removed from his home." The threat had been clear. Scandal for scandal, exposure for exposure. Caleb had looked between them, his face mottled red, his hands clenched into fists. But he'd been raised in a world where image was everything, where public scenes meant permanent damage to carefully cultivated reputations. "This isn't over," he'd said finally, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "No," Dominic had agreed. "But it's over for tonight. Security?" Two men in dark suits had materialized from the crowd, their presence a silent promise. Caleb had looked at Elena one last time, and she'd seen something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Not just anger, but promise. The promise that he would find a way to destroy this, to take back what he believed was his. Then he'd turned and stalked toward the exit, the security team following at a discreet distance. The crowd had gradually dispersed, conversations resuming with the kind of forced casualness that meant everyone would be gossiping about this for weeks. Dominic had turned back to Elena, his hand finding hers. "Are you all right?" She'd realized she was crying, silent tears tracking down her carefully made-up face. "He's not going to stop." "I know. That's why this is just the beginning." Dominic had pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, gently wiping her tears. "Tonight we showed him you're protected. Tomorrow, we make sure he can never touch you or Lucas again." "How?" His smile had been sharp, dangerous, and strangely reassuring. "By doing what I do best, destroying men who deserve it." The morning after the gala, Elena woke to find Dominic already in her suite sitting room, his laptop open on the coffee table, several manila folders spread around him like battle plans. "You don't believe in knocking?" she asked, tightening the belt of her robe as she padded in from the bedroom. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I did knock. You were asleep. Lucas let me in." Elena's heart stopped. "Lucas can't even walk yet. He's..." "Joking. Bad joke." Dominic closed the laptop. "Maria let me in. She's with Lucas in the nursery. I wanted to talk before the lawyers arrive." "Lawyers plural?" "3 of them. The best family law attorneys money can buy." He gestured to the folders. "We're filing for full custody today. Emergency protective order against Caleb. And we're going to bury him in so much legal paperwork he won't see daylight for months." Elena sat on the edge of the sofa, her mind still foggy with sleep and residual fear from last night. "He made a scene. In front of 500 people. Won't that help us?" "It helps, but it's not enough." Dominic opened one of the folders, revealing photographs that made Elena's stomach turn. Caleb left the gala and went directly to a bar. My security team followed him. He got drunk, got belligerent, and assaulted a waitress who reminded him of you. The photograph showed Caleb being restrained by bar security, his face twisted in rage, his expensive tuxedo disheveled. Another showed the waitress, a young blonde woman with terror in her eyes. "Is she okay?" Elena whispered. Shaken but unharmed, and willing to press charges, especially after my lawyer explained that her testimony could help protect another woman from the same man. Dominic's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. "We now have documented proof of violent behavior from last night. Combined with his outburst at the gala, witnessed by half the city's elite, we have a pattern." Elena stared at these photographs, seeing her own past reflected in that waitress's frightened face. "You planned this." "I expected it. There's a difference." Dominic leaned back, studying her. "Men like Caleb don't handle loss of control well. I knew that confronting him publicly would push him to make a mistake. I just didn't know which mistake he'd choose." "You used him. Used his violence against him." "Yes. Is that a problem?" Elena thought about it, examining her own reaction. She should have felt manipulated, used as bait in Dominic's chess game. Instead, she felt something closer to satisfaction. No, it's not a problem. Good, because we're about to do much worse. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker. I had my investigators dig into Caleb's finances. He's been embezzling from his family's pharmaceutical company for 3 years. Small amounts at first, but escalating. Currently, he's about $2 million in debt to some very unpleasant people. Elena's eyes widened. Gambling. Cryptocurrency speculation. He made some bad investments, tried to dig himself out by making riskier ones, and now he's drowning. His family doesn't know yet, but they will, unless he cooperates. The pieces clicked into place in Elena's mind. You're going to blackmail him. I'm going to offer him a choice. Dominic's smile was cold. Sign away all parental rights to Lucas, agree to a restraining order, and leave the country voluntarily. In exchange, I'll pay off his debts, and his family never learns about his embezzlement. And if he refuses, then I expose everything. The embezzlement, the assault from last night, his sealed juvenile record that I've unsealed, and the testimony from 3 former girlfriends who are suddenly very willing to talk about their experiences with Caleb Thorne. He paused. He'll be destroyed. Financially, socially, legally. His family will disown him, his trust fund will evaporate, and he'll spend the next decade fighting criminal charges. Elena should have been horrified by the ruthless efficiency of Dominic's plan. Instead, she found herself asking, when do we tell him? This afternoon. I've arranged a meeting at my downtown office. Neutral territory, public enough that he can't make a scene, private enough for honest conversation. Dominic stood collecting the folders. The question is whether you want to be there when I do it. The thought of facing Caleb again made her stomach clench, but the thought of hiding while someone else fought her battles made her feel worse. I want to be there. It won't be pleasant. He'll say things designed to hurt you, to make you doubt yourself. He's been doing that for years. I'm used to it. Dominic studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Elena. Or maybe I'm just tired of being afraid. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He moved toward the door, then paused. The lawyers will be here at 9, dressed professionally. We're presenting you as Lucas's mother and my partner, someone with resources and standing, not the woman Caleb tried to break. After he left, Elena stood in her suite, looking out at the grounds where Lucas was probably playing with Maria under the watchful eyes of his security detail. 24 hours ago, she'd been a maid hiding from her past. Now she was planning to destroy the man who'd haunted her nightmares for 18 months. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like waking up after a long, drugged sleep. The meeting with the lawyers was exactly as intense as Elena had anticipated. 3 sharp-eyed attorneys who treated her custody battle like a military operation, asking questions that forced her to relive the worst moments of her relationship with Caleb. But unlike the times Caleb had interrogated her, these questions came with the promise of protection rather than punishment. Did he ever strike you? The family law specialist, a woman named Patricia Chen, asked. Not directly. He grabbed my arms hard enough to leave bruises, shoved me once into a wall, but he was always careful not to hit where it would show. Patricia made notes on her legal pad. And your son? You mentioned seeing a bruise. On his arm. Small, but in the exact shape of Caleb's fingers. Elena's voice cracked. That's when I knew I had to leave. I could survive his control, but I couldn't let him hurt Lucas. That's good, Patricia said, and at Elena's startled look, clarified. Not good that it happened. Good that you have a clear, documented reason for leaving. Combined with the incident from last night and the financial crimes Mr. Varela has uncovered, we have a strong case for an emergency custody order. By noon, the paperwork was filed. By 2 o'clock, Elena was sitting in Dominic's downtown office, all glass and steel and spectacular city views, waiting for Caleb to arrive. Dominic sat behind his desk, perfectly composed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Caleb's car. Elena occupied one of the leather chairs facing the desk, positioned so she'd be visible when Caleb entered but protected by Dominic's presence. You don't have to say anything, Dominic reminded her. I'll handle the negotiation. You're here as a statement, a reminder that you're not alone anymore. I know. I just want to see his face when he realizes he's lost. Dominic's expression softened slightly. That's the woman who saved premature babies for a living. I wondered when she'd show up again. Before Elena could respond, the office door opened and Caleb walked in, flanked by his own lawyer, an older man in an expensive suit who looked deeply uncomfortable. Caleb's eyes went immediately to Elena, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something uglier. So this is real. You're actually with him. Sit down, Mr. Thorne, Dominic said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even Caleb's lawyer move toward the offered chairs. We have matters to discuss. Caleb remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. I'm not discussing anything until you explain what the hell you think you're doing with my fiancé and my son. Elena is my partner, not your fiancé, and Lucas's custody is currently under review by family court. Dominic opened a folder on his desk. But we're not here to debate your delusions. We're here to offer you a choice. I don't take orders from criminals. No, you take money from them. $2 million worth, to be precise. Dominic slid a document across the desk. Cryptocurrency investments gone wrong. Debts to people who don't accept payment plans. You've been embezzling from Thorne Pharmaceuticals to cover your losses. Caleb's face went white, then red. His lawyer picked up the document, his expression growing grimmer with each page. That's fabricated, Caleb stammered. You can't prove. I can prove all of it. Bank records, cryptocurrency wallets, email correspondence with your offshore accounts. Dominic's voice remained level. Your family doesn't know yet, but they will, unless you accept my offer. What offer? Caleb's lawyer asked, his tone suggesting he already knew this was a losing battle. Dominic pulled out another document. Caleb signs away all parental rights to Lucas. He agrees to a permanent restraining order, no contact with Elena or the child. He leaves the country within 30 days and doesn't return for a minimum of 5 years. In exchange, I pay off his debts and the embezzlement evidence disappears. The room was silent except for the sound of Caleb's ragged breathing. You can't do this, Caleb said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I have rights. Lucas is my son. Is he? Elena spoke for the first time, her voice steady. Because in 18 months, you never filed a missing persons report, never contacted the police, never did anything except hire private investigators to hunt me down. Why is that, Caleb? He stared at her, and she saw the moment he realized his mistake. Filing a police report would have meant questions about why Elena ran, medical examinations that might have revealed past injuries, investigations that could have exposed his carefully hidden violence. Because I was trying to protect you, he said, switching tactics. I didn't want you arrested for parental kidnapping. How generous, Elena leaned forward. But we both know the real reason. You couldn't risk anyone looking too closely at our relationship. Couldn't risk the Thorne family name being associated with domestic violence. You're making this up. She's lying, Caleb said desperately to his lawyer. She's unstable. She ran away with our child. She was protecting herself and her son from an abuser, Dominic interrupted. And now she has the resources to prove it. 3 of your ex-girlfriends are willing to testify about your controlling behavior. We have the assault from last night on camera. We have financial crimes documented in detail. And we have a judge who's very interested in why a father wouldn't report his missing child unless he had something to hide. Caleb's lawyer set down the documents. Mr. Thorne, I strongly advise you to consider this offer. The alternative is I fight, Caleb snarled. I have money, connections, family resources. Had, Dominic corrected. You had those things, but your family's patience has limits, and embezzlement tends to exceed those limits. When I expose what you've done, the Thornes will cut you off to protect their reputation. You'll have nothing. I'll tell everyone what you are, Caleb said, turning his fury on Dominic. A crime lord, a killer, a man powerful enough to destroy you completely while barely lifting a finger. Dominic's voice dropped into something dangerous. Go ahead, Caleb. Tell everyone what I am, but be aware that the moment you do, I stop protecting you. I release every piece of evidence I have. I make sure everyone knows that Caleb Thorne beats women and steals from his family. I guarantee you'll spend your next birthday in a federal prison while your son grows up calling another man father. The threat hung in the air, heavy with promise. Elena watched Caleb's face as reality crashed over him. She'd seen this expression before, the moment when his control slipped and he realized he couldn't manipulate his way out of a situation. It was the same look he'd had when she'd grabbed Lucas and run, when he'd understood too late that she was serious. "How long do I have to decide?" Caleb asked finally, his voice hollow. 24 hours, Dominic said. "Sign the papers, and this nightmare ends for everyone. Refuse, and I promise you'll regret it for the rest of your considerably shortened life." Caleb's lawyer gathered the documents. "We'll review everything and be in touch." "Do that." Dominic stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "And Caleb, if you go anywhere near Elena or Lucas before those papers are signed, the deal is off the table and I release everything immediately. Clear?" Caleb didn't answer, just turned and walked out, his lawyer following with the defeated posture of a man who knew his client was finished. When the door closed behind them, Elena released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Do you think he'll sign?" "Yes, because the alternative is worse than exile, and Caleb is fundamentally a coward. He only fights battles he knows he can win." Dominic moved around the desk, sitting on its edge so they were at eye level. "How are you feeling?" "Powerful," Elena said, surprising herself with the truth. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel powerful." "Good, because this is just the beginning." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that felt both practiced and genuine. "The hardest part is over. Now we wait." The waiting was agony. 24 hours stretched into an eternity of second-guessing and worst-case scenarios. Elena spent the time with Lucas, holding him closer than usual, memorizing the weight of him in her arms in case this all fell apart, and Caleb found a way to take him after all. But Dominic's prediction proved accurate. 23 hours and 47 minutes after their meeting, Caleb's lawyer called. The papers were signed. Caleb had agreed to everything: the termination of parental rights, the restraining order, the exile. Elena sat in Dominic's study when he delivered the news, Lucas sleeping in her lap, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. "It's over?" she asked, not quite believing it. "It's over. You're free, Elena. Both of you." She looked down at her son, at his peaceful face, and felt tears stream down her cheeks. Not from fear this time, but from relief so profound it felt like breaking apart and reassembling all at once. Dominic handed her a tissue, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You can cry. You've earned it." "I thought I'd feel different," she said through her tears, "like the fear would just disappear, but it's still there. It will be for a while. Trauma doesn't evaporate the moment the threat is removed. You'll need time to trust that you're really safe." He paused. "I have someone I'd like you to talk to. A therapist who specializes in domestic violence survivors. No pressure, but the offer is there." Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The next weeks blurred together in a strange mixture of liberation and adjustment. Caleb left the country as promised, relocated to Singapore where his family had business interests and where Dominic's reach ensured he stayed compliant. The restraining order was filed, made permanent by a judge who'd seen the evidence and the assault from the gala night. Lucas's custody was officially, legally, entirely Elena's, but freedom came with its own complications. Elena had built her life around hiding, around fear, around the constant awareness of being hunted. Without that driving terror, she felt unmoored, uncertain of who she was supposed to be now. The therapist Dominic had recommended helped. Dr. Sarah Lynn was gentle but direct, pulling Elena through the wreckage of her past relationship and helping her identify the patterns that had made her vulnerable in the first place. "You were taught to make yourself small," Dr. Lynn said during one session, "by your parents, who valued compliance, by medical school, which rewarded those who didn't make waves, and then by Caleb, who exploited that conditioning to control you. And now?" Elena asked. "Now you learn how to take up space again, how to trust your own judgment, how to exist without fear." It was harder than Elena had anticipated. The mansion felt both like a sanctuary and a new cage, luxurious, protected, but still defined by someone else's rules, someone else's power. Her relationship with Dominic evolved into something strange and complicated. They maintained the public facade of a couple, attending events together, his hand possessive at her back, their interactions intimate enough to convince outsiders. But in private, They existed in a careful dance of boundaries and unspoken questions. He never pushed for more than their arrangement stipulated, never assumed access to her space or her body beyond what was necessary for appearances. But there were moments, a look that lasted too long, a touch that lingered, conversations that drifted into genuine connection rather than strategic planning. "Tell me about your mother," Elena said one evening. They were in his study, sharing dinner as they often did now, Lucas already asleep upstairs. Dominic had looked up from his wine, surprised. "Why?" "Because you mentioned her once, and I realized I know almost nothing about you beyond the reputation." He'd been quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he'd set down his glass and begun to speak. "Her name was Isabella. She was 20 when she married my father, already a concert pianist with a promising career. He was 15 years older, wealthy, connected. On paper, it was a perfect match." Dominic's voice had gone distant. "She gave up performing when I was born. My father wanted a wife who stayed home, who was available whenever he needed her. She agreed because that's what women in her generation did." "Did she love him?" "I think she loved the idea of him, the stability, the security. She'd grown up poor, so wealth felt like freedom." His smile was bitter. She didn't realize she was trading one kind of poverty for another. "What happened to your father?" "Heart attack when I was 21. Sudden, massive. He died believing he'd built an empire that would last generations." Dominic had met her eyes. "I took apart everything he built and reconstructed it my way. Less legitimate, more profitable, completely free of his vision." Elena had understood then. Dominic's entire life was a rebellion against his father's control, just as hers had become a rebellion against Caleb's. "We're both running from ghosts," she'd observed. "Maybe. Or maybe we're just refusing to be haunted." 3 months after Caleb's exile, Dominic announced they would be attending the annual Mayor's Ball, the city's biggest social event where politicians and business leaders and society elite mingled in a performance of power and influence. "I need to make an appearance," he'd explained over breakfast, "and it's time to formalize our arrangement publicly." Elena had looked up from feeding Lucas his breakfast. Formalize how? Dominic had pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, setting it on the table between them. "We've been together long enough that people are asking questions. Whether this is serious, whether I intend to make it permanent." Elena's heart had started racing. "And do you?" "I intend to make it look permanent, which requires this." He'd opened the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away. A large emerald surrounded by diamonds, the kind of ring that made statements and claimed territory. "An engagement ring," she'd whispered. "A performance piece, meant to convince the world that you're mine permanently." He'd met her eyes. "Unless you're not comfortable with that level of commitment to the arrangement." Elena had stared at the ring, at the physical manifestation of the lie they'd been living for months. Except it didn't feel entirely like a lie anymore. They'd built something in the space between pretend and real, a partnership based on mutual protection that had somehow evolved into genuine care. "What happens if I say yes?" she'd asked. "We get engaged? Publicly. I announce it at the mayor's ball, we smile for cameras, and the city stops questioning whether you belong at my side." He'd paused. "And you get legal protection that goes beyond a simple arrangement. As my fiancé, you'd have access to my resources even if something happened to me. Lucas would be provided for, no matter what." It was practical, strategic. Everything Dominic ever did was calculated for maximum protection and minimum vulnerability. So why did Elena's hand shake when she reached for the ring? "Yes," she'd said, sliding it onto her finger where it fit perfectly. "Let's get engaged." Dominic's expression had shifted into something that might have been satisfaction or might have been something deeper. "Then we have a ball to prepare for, my fiancé." The word had sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. The mayor's ball was 3 weeks away, which gave Vera exactly enough time to create what she called a dress that would stop traffic and start rumors. Elena had learned not to question Vera's vision, so when the designer insisted on 6 fittings for a single gown, she'd complied without complaint. The result, when Elena finally saw it complete, justified every minute. The dress was midnight blue silk that seemed to shift between navy and black depending on the light, cut to follow every curve before flowing into a dramatic train. The back was open to her waist, and the front had a neckline just daring enough to suggest confidence without crossing into impropriety. "You look like power wrapped in beauty," Vera had pronounced. "Exactly what we want. When Dominic announces the engagement, every camera will already be on you." But the dress was the easy part. The hard part was preparing for what came after the announcement. Dominic's lawyer had drawn up a new contract to replace their original arrangement, this one more comprehensive and binding. Elena had read through it twice with Dr. Lin present, making sure she understood every clause. "This gives you significant legal rights," Dr. Lin had observed. "Access to his finances, legal authority to make decisions on his behalf if he's incapacitated, guardianship provisions for Lucas. This is more than a performance contract, Elena." "I know." Elena had signed it anyway, telling herself it was just more protection, more security. Telling herself the flutter in her chest when she thought about being Dominic's fiancé was purely practical concern. The night before the ball, Elena couldn't sleep. She'd checked on Lucas 3 times, reorganized her jewelry box twice, and finally given up on rest entirely, wrapping herself in a robe and padding down to Dominic's study where she knew he'd still be working. She'd knock softly, hearing his voice call for her to enter. He'd been at his desk as expected, reading glasses perched on his nose, surrounded by paperwork that probably represented someone's fortune or downfall. He'd looked up when she entered, and something in his expression had softened. "Can't sleep?" he'd asked. "Too much thinking." Dangerous habit. He'd set aside his reading glasses, giving her his full attention. "What's troubling you?" Elena had crossed to the window, looking out at the grounds bathed in moonlight. "Tomorrow, when you announce our engagement, everything becomes more real, more permanent. And I keep wondering what happens when the performance becomes indistinguishable from reality." She'd heard him stand, felt him approach until he was close enough that she could sense his warmth at her back. "Is that what scares you?" he'd asked quietly. "That it might become real?" "I don't know what scares me anymore. 3 months ago, I was terrified of everything. Now I'm standing in a mansion wearing a robe that costs more than my nursing degree, about to pretend to marry a man who destroys people for a living, and I feel safer than I've ever felt in my life." She'd turned to face him. That can't be healthy. Dominic had smiled slightly. Safety takes many forms. Sometimes the most dangerous-looking option is actually the safest one available. "Is that what you are? The dangerous-looking safe option?" "I'm whatever you need me to be, Elena. That's the arrangement." "And what if I don't know what I need?" He'd reached out then, his hand cupping her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she knew about him. "Then we figure it out together. That's what partners do." The word had hung between them, loaded with meanings that had nothing to do with their legal contract. Elena had found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes closing for just a moment. "Dominic, I know." His thumb had brushed her cheekbone. "I know this is complicated. I know you're not ready for anything beyond what we agreed to. And I'm not pushing, Elena. I just want you to understand that whatever this arrangement becomes, you're safe with me. Always." She'd opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. They'd been standing like that, close enough to cross a dozen boundaries they'd carefully maintained, when footsteps in the hallway had made them spring apart. Victor had appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Sorry to interrupt, boss. We have a situation at the East Warehouse." Dominic's hand had dropped from Elena's face, his professional mask sliding back into place. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that needs your personal attention." Elena had recognized the code for something dangerous, something that reminded her that Dominic's world operated on rules she was still learning. "I should go. Let you handle. Whatever that is." Dominic had caught her hand as she'd moved past him. "Tomorrow night, at the ball. Stay close to me. No matter what happens." She'd nodded, seen something in his eyes that looked almost like worry. Then he'd released her and followed Victor out, leaving Elena alone in his study with her thoughts and her racing heart. The next day had been a blur of final preparations. Hair and makeup, the stunning dress, jewelry that required its own security detail. Lucas had been settled with Maria and his usual guards, plus 3 additional security personnel Dominic had assigned specifically for the evening. "You're sure he'll be safe?" Elena had asked for the 4th time. "The mansion is locked down tighter than a Federal Reserve," Dominic had assured her. No one gets in or out without my personal authorization. Lucas is safer here than anywhere else in the world. When Elena had finally descended the main staircase, she'd found Dominic waiting at the bottom, looking devastating in a tuxedo that had definitely been custom made. His eyes had tracked her descent with an appreciation that had felt different than his usual calculated assessment. "You're staring," she'd said when she'd reached the bottom step. "You're stunning. I'm allowed to stare at my fiancé." The words still sent electricity through her system. She'd taken his offered arm, letting him guide her to the waiting car. Not the usual SUV, but a sleek town car that screamed wealth and status. The ride to the Grand Hotel ballroom had been quiet, Dominic's hand covering hers in her lap, his thumb tracing absent patterns on her skin. Elena had found herself watching the city lights blur past, thinking about how different this was from the terrified drive she'd taken when running from Caleb. Then she'd been alone, desperate, convinced she'd never feel safe again. Now she was sitting beside a man whose reputation should have terrified her, feeling more protected than she'd ever imagined possible. The Grand Hotel was everything its name promised: marble and crystal and old money elegance. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers filled with the city's most powerful people dressed in their most expensive clothes, all performing the intricate dance of influence and status. When Dominic and Elena had entered, conversations had paused in that telltale way that meant people were watching. Elena had straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and let Dominic guide her into the crowd like they owned the room, which, given Dominic's influence, they essentially did. "Mr. Varela, wonderful to see you," the mayor himself had greeted them, his politician smile bright and practiced. "And this must be the lovely Elena we've heard so much about." "My partner," Dominic had said, the word carrying weight. "We're actually here tonight to share some personal news." The mayor's eyebrows had risen. "Oh? But we'll save it for later in the evening. Don't want to steal your thunder, Mayor." They'd moved through the crowd, Dominic introducing her to people whose names she recognized from news headlines and financial magazines. Elena had played her role perfectly, charming when needed, reserved when appropriate, always staying close to Dominic's side with the kind of comfort that suggested genuine intimacy. An hour into the evening, Elena had been standing with a group of philanthropists discussing childhood literacy programs when she'd felt Dominic tense beside her. She'd followed his gaze to see a man approaching, late 50s, expensive suit, walking with the kind of confidence that came from inherited power. "Dominic," the man had said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show tonight." "Marcus," Dominic's voice had gone cold. "I wasn't sure they'd let you out of the investigation long enough to attend." The barb had been delivered smoothly, but Elena had felt its impact. The other philanthropists had suddenly found reasons to drift away, leaving the three of them in a small pocket of tense privacy. "Investigation?" Elena had asked quietly. "Marcus Klein," Dominic had said, still watching the other man with predatory focus. "Federal prosecutor. He's been trying to build a case against me for 3 years. Marcus's smile had widened. 4 years, actually, and I'm getting close, Varela. That warehouse situation last night? We have surveillance footage of your men moving some very interesting cargo." Elena's blood had gone cold. This was the situation Victor had interrupted them for. And now this prosecutor was using it as a weapon at a social event. "Interesting cargo," Dominic had repeated. "Such as?" "I think we both know. The question is whether your lovely companion here knows what kind of business you're really in." Marcus had turned his attention to Elena. "Ms. Cross, isn't it? Or should I say Dr. Morgan? Yes, I know who you really are. I know you're hiding from Caleb Thorne. I know you have a son. And I know you've made a deal with a very dangerous man to protect yourself." Elena's heart had hammered against her ribs, but she'd kept her expression neutral. Months of practice hiding fear had given her that skill, at least. "What I know," she'd said carefully, "is that Dominic has shown me more respect and protection in 3 months than some men show their partners in a lifetime. Whatever investigation you're conducting has nothing to do with me, doesn't it?" Marcus had leaned in slightly. "Because when Dominic goes down, and he will, everyone close to him goes down too. His lawyers, his business partners, his associates, and yes, his fiancée. especially if she's been helping him launder money through charitable foundations. That's enough, Dominic had said, his voice dropping into something dangerous. You want to threaten me, fine, but you leave Elena out of this. I'm just offering friendly advice. She should know what she's getting into. Marcus had straightened his cufflinks. Lovely party, by the way. Enjoy it while you can. These kinds of gatherings are difficult to attend from federal prison. He'd walked away, leaving Elena trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Is it true? She'd asked quietly. About the warehouse? It's complicated. That's not an answer. Dominic had guided her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, his hand firm at her back. When they were relatively alone, he'd turned to face her. What Marcus saw was a shipment of medical supplies. Legitimate, legal medical supplies. What he doesn't know is that those supplies are headed to a clinic in a neighborhood where people can't afford health care. A clinic I fund anonymously because getting the proper permits would take years and people are dying now. Elena had stared at him. You run illegal clinics? I run necessary clinics. The bureaucracy of legal health care means poor people die waiting for approval. I don't wait for approval. His expression had been challenging. Does that change things for you? She'd thought about it, examining her own moral compass. Dominic broke laws, yes, but he broke them to save lives, to provide care to people the system had abandoned. How was that different from what she'd done as a nurse, breaking protocol to give desperate parents extra time with their dying children? No, she'd said finally, it doesn't change things. Something had shifted in his expression, relief maybe, or respect. Marcus is going to keep pushing, using you to get to me. We can call off the engagement announcement if you want. Give you plausible deniability. And let him think he scared me away? Absolutely not. Elena had straightened her shoulders, feeling that surge of power she'd discovered when Caleb had signed away his rights. We're doing this. Make the announcement, Dominic. Show everyone exactly where I stand. His smile had been genuine, proud. As you wish, my fierce fiancé. 20 minutes later, the mayor had called for attention, and Dominic had taken Elena's hand, leading her onto the small stage area where a podium had been set up for speeches. I've been asked to share some personal news, Dominic had begun, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. 3 months ago, I met someone who challenged everything I thought I knew about partnership and trust. Someone who showed me that strength isn't always loud, and courage isn't always obvious. Elena's heart had pounded as hundreds of eyes focused on them. Elena came into my life quietly, but she's changed it completely. She's brilliant, compassionate, and brave in ways that humble me. And tonight, I'm honored to announce that she's agreed to become my wife. The ballroom had erupted in applause and gasps and immediate speculation. Camera flashes had gone off like lightning. And through it all, Dominic had pulled Elena close, his hand at her waist, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her forget they were performing. May I? He'd asked quietly, and she'd known he was asking permission to kiss her, to make this performance complete. She'd nodded, and when his lips had touched hers, she'd felt something fundamental shift. The kiss had been gentle, almost tender, nothing like the claiming she'd expected. It had felt like a question and a promise all at once. When they'd broken apart, the applause had been deafening, but Elena had barely heard it over the sound of her own racing heart. The rest of the evening had passed in a blur of congratulations and speculation. People had wanted to see the ring, hear how they'd met, know when the wedding would be. Elena had let Dominic field most of the questions, following his lead as they navigated the social performance. But underneath the performance, something had been growing. Every time Dominic's hand found hers, every time he'd leaned close to murmur something in her ear, every protective gesture and genuine smile had added up to a truth Elena was afraid to acknowledge. This arrangement was becoming real. They'd been preparing to leave when Victor had appeared again, his expression grim. "Boss, we need to go. Now." Elena's stomach had dropped. "Lucas? The mansion's secure, but we're getting reports of unusual activity in the area. Could be nothing, but I want you both back behind our walls." The ride home had been tense. 2 security vehicles flanking their town car, Victor coordinating with the mansion's security team through an earpiece. Dominic had kept Elena's hand clasped in his body positioned between her and the car door like he could physically shield her from whatever threat was approaching. When they'd finally pulled through the mansion gates, Elena had practically run inside, heading straight for the nursery where Lucas was sleeping peacefully, unaware of any danger. "He's fine," Maria had assured her. "No trouble at all. The extra guards haven't even been needed." But Elena had stayed there anyway, watching her son sleep, until she'd felt Dominic's presence behind her. "False alarm," he'd said quietly. Victor's team checked the perimeter. Someone was taking photos of the grounds, probably press hoping for engagement pictures. Nothing threatening. Elena had nodded, not turning around. "This is my life now. Wondering if every shadow is a threat, if every person with a camera is someone who wants to hurt us. Yes, this is the cost of my protection." Dominic had moved to stand beside her, both of them watching Lucas. "If it's too high a price, Elena, tell me now. I can arrange other protection, help you start over somewhere safe." She'd looked at him then, at this complicated man who'd given her freedom from one cage while inviting her into another. "And if I don't want to start over somewhere else? Then we figure out how to make this work, how to keep you and Lucas safe while giving you the life you deserve." "What life is that?" "One where you're not afraid, where you can practice medicine again if you want, or pursue whatever makes you happy, where Lucas grows up secure and loved, never wondering if he's safe." Dominic had turned to face her fully. "That kiss tonight, on the stage, did it feel like performance to you?" Elena's breath had caught. "I don't know how to answer that." "Then don't answer. Just know that for me it stopped being performance weeks ago." His admission had hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. "I know the timing is terrible. I know you're still healing. But I need you to know that when I call you my fiancé, when I stand beside you and promise protection, that's real, Elena. All of it." She'd wanted to say something, anything, but her throat had closed up with emotions she couldn't name. "You don't have to respond," Dominic had continued. "I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I just need you to know that you're safe with me. Not because of a contract or an arrangement, but because He'd stopped himself. "Because you matter. You and Lucas both." The unfinished confession had felt more intimate than if he'd spoken the words. Elena had reached out, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had nothing to do with public performance. "I'm scared," she'd whispered. "Scared of trusting this. Scared of what happens if I let myself believe it's real and it all falls apart. I know, and I'm not asking you to trust it yet. Just consider the possibility that it might be real, that we might be building something worth keeping." They'd stood there in the nursery, hands clasped, watching Lucas sleep, and Elena had felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. The next morning had brought the predicted media frenzy. Photos of the engagement announcement were everywhere. Society pages, gossip sites, even legitimate news outlets covering the surprise engagement of crime boss Dominic Varela. Elena had avoided looking at most of them, but Maria had brought her one newspaper with a particularly striking photo. It had shown the moment right before the kiss, Dominic and Elena looking at each other with expressions that had nothing to do with performance. The caption read, "A love story or a strategic alliance?" Sources close to Varela suggest the reclusive businessman has finally found his match. "You look happy in this picture," Maria had observed. "Truly happy, not performing." Elena had studied the photograph, seeing the truth in Maria's words. She did look happy. And more terrifying, she looked like she was falling in love. That afternoon, Dr. Lin had called for an emergency session. Elena had sat in the therapist's office, still processing the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. "Tell me what you're feeling," Dr. Lin had prompted. "Confused, terrified, like I'm standing on the edge of something enormous, and I don't know if I should jump or run. What does the edge represent?" Real feelings for Dominic, the possibility that this arrangement could become an actual relationship. Elena had twisted her engagement ring around her finger. "I told myself this was just protection, just a practical solution to my Caleb problem, but it's becoming something else, and I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Are you afraid of Dominic?" "No, that's what's so strange. I should be afraid of him. He's dangerous, powerful, operates outside the law, but I feel safer with him than I've felt with anyone." "Then what are you afraid of?" Elena had been quiet for a long moment. "I'm afraid of being wrong about him." Afraid that I'm confusing protection with love because I've been vulnerable for so long. Afraid that I'm repeating the same pattern that got me into trouble with Caleb. How is Dominic similar to Caleb? They're both powerful men who saw something in me and decided they wanted me in their lives. And how are they different? Elena had thought about it carefully. Caleb saw my weaknesses and exploited them. He wanted to make me smaller, more dependent, easier to control. Dominic sees my weaknesses and protects them. He wants to make me stronger, more independent, safer. Does Dominic try to control you? He's very protective, sometimes overprotective. But does he try to control your choices? Your autonomy? Elena had realized the answer immediately. No. He asks, he suggests, he warns me when he thinks something is dangerous, but he doesn't demand or forbid, even when he clearly wants to. That's a significant difference, Elena. Caleb was an abuser who used control to maintain power. Dominic is a protector who offers strength without demanding submission. Dr. Lin had leaned forward. But here's the real question. What do you want? Not what's practical, not what's safe. What does your heart want? The answer had risen up before Elena could stop it. I want it to be real. I want to stop pretending and just be with him. Actually be with him. Saying it out loud had felt like stepping off a cliff. That evening, Elena had found Dominic in his study, going through paperwork that she now recognized as the legitimate business side of his empire: real estate investments, charitable foundations, corporate holdings. Can we talk? She'd asked from the doorway. He'd looked up, something shifting in his expression when he'd seen her face. Always. Come in. She'd closed the door behind her, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been in weeks. Last night you said something about the kiss, about it being real for you. I did. I need to know what you meant, specifically. Dominic had set aside his papers, giving her his complete attention. I meant that somewhere between rescuing you from Marco and announcing our engagement, I stopped playing a role. The protectiveness, the pride when you stand up for yourself, the satisfaction when I see you healing, that's all real. And the kiss? He'd stood, moving around the desk. That was me kissing the woman I'm falling for, not maintaining a facade. Elena's heart had stuttered. You're falling for me? Have been for weeks, maybe longer. I tried to keep it professional, tried to maintain the boundaries of our arrangement. But you're extraordinary, Elena. The way you've rebuilt yourself. The strength it took to run from Caleb. The fierceness with which you protect Lucas. I've never met anyone like you. She'd moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. I'm still healing, still figuring out who I am without fear defining me. I know. And I'm not asking you to rush that healing. I just need you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Not as part of an arrangement, but as someone who cares about you more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. Elena had looked up at him, this dangerous man who'd given her safety, this criminal who'd shown her kindness, this protector who'd helped her find her strength again. What if I'm ready now? She'd whispered. What if I want to try making this real? Dominic's hands had framed her face with infinite gentleness. Then we try. Slowly, carefully, at whatever pace you need. No pressure, no expectations beyond seeing where this goes. I'm scared of trusting this. I know. Trust me anyway. And then he'd kissed her, and this time it wasn't performance or announcement. It was just them, two broken people who'd found unexpected healing in each other. When they'd finally broken apart, Elena had rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. We're really doing this, she'd murmured, making this arrangement into something real. We are. And Elena? She'd looked up to find him smiling, genuine and warm. I promise to earn your trust every single day, to protect you without controlling you, to stand beside you as you become whoever you're meant to be. That's a big promise. I'm very good at keeping my promises. And standing there in his arms, feeling safe and chosen and genuinely cared for, Elena had let herself believe him. The shift from arrangement to relationship was both subtle and seismic. Outwardly, nothing changed. Elena still lived in her suite, Dominic still maintained professional boundaries, and Lucas still had his army of protective guards. But the moments between them had transformed into something precious and fragile. like watching ice melt into spring water. They started having breakfast together every morning, not as strategy sessions, but as actual conversation. Dominic would read the financial news while Elena fed Lucas, and they'd discuss everything from city politics to Lucas's latest developmental milestone. Sometimes Dominic would reach across the table to wipe applesauce from Elena's cheek, and she'd catch his hand, pressing a kiss to his palm in a gesture that still made her blush. "You're getting comfortable with affection," Dr. Lin had observed during their next session. "With his affection," Elena had corrected. "It feels different than what I had with Caleb, less like obligation and more like choice." Because it is choice. You're choosing him as much as he's choosing you. But choice came with its own complications. 2 weeks after they had acknowledged their real feelings, Marcus Klein had made his move. Elena had been in the library with Lucas, reading him a story about dragons and knights, when Victor had appeared in the doorway with an expression that made her stomach drop. "We have a situation. The feds are at the gate with a search warrant." She'd scooped up Lucas immediately, her heart racing. "For what?" "The warehouse. They're claiming probable cause to search the mansion for evidence of illegal medical supply trafficking." Victor's jaw had been tight. "Boss is handling it, but he wants you and Lucas in the safe room until this is resolved." The safe room turned out to be exactly what it sounded like: a reinforced space hidden behind Dominic's study, equipped with supplies, communications equipment, and enough security measures to withstand a siege. Maria had been waiting there, her face pale, but composed. "How long do we have to stay here?" Elena had asked, settling Lucas on her lap even as he'd squirmed to get down and explore. "Until Mr. Varela gives the all clear." Maria had pulled out some toys she'd grabbed from the nursery. Could be hours. Could be longer. It had been 4 hours. 4 hours of listening to muffled voices and footsteps overhead, of watching Lucas play while her mind conjured increasingly terrible scenarios. What if they arrested Dominic? What if they found something that could be twisted into evidence? What if Marcus succeeded in destroying the life they were building? When the hidden door had finally opened, Elena had jumped to her feet, relaxing only slightly when she'd seen it was Dominic. But he'd looked exhausted, his tie loosened, and his expression grim. "It's over. They're gone." "Did they find anything?" "Nothing. Because there was nothing to find. The medical supplies were already delivered to the clinic, properly documented as charitable donations." He'd run a hand through his hair. "But Marcus isn't done. He's going to keep pushing until he finds something that sticks." Elena had handed Lucas to Maria, moving to stand in front of Dominic. "Then we need to stop giving him ammunition. The illegal clinics, can you make them legal? The permit process takes years. So start the process. Play by their rules for once." She'd put her hands on his chest, feeling his heart beating hard beneath her palms. "I know you hate bureaucracy, but if going legitimate means Marcus can't touch you, isn't it worth it?" Dominic had covered her hands with his. "Going fully legitimate means exposing every aspect of my business to scrutiny. Some things won't survive that exposure." "Then let them go. Keep the parts that can survive the light and abandon the rest." "You're asking me to dismantle half my empire. I'm asking you to choose which empire matters more, the one built in shadows or the one we could build together in the open." The challenge had hung between them, and Elena had seen the moment Dominic had made his choice. He'd pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "You're going to be the death of my criminal career," he'd murmured. "Good. I prefer you alive and legitimate." He'd laughed, the sound rough and genuine. "Then legitimate it is. Starting tomorrow, I'm calling my lawyers, and we're beginning the process of converting everything to legal operations." "Everything?" "Everything that matters." He'd kissed her then, soft and sweet, while Lucas had made happy babbling sounds in Maria's arms. "You've made me want a different future, Elena. One where I don't have to hide what I am or what I do. One where Lucas can grow up knowing exactly who I am without being ashamed." The transformation had begun immediately. Dominic's lawyers had descended on the mansion like a well-dressed army, armed with documents and strategies for converting his various enterprises into legitimate businesses. The illegal clinics became properly permitted medical centers, funded through a foundation that could withstand any federal scrutiny. The warehouse operations transformed into licensed medical supply distribution. Even the more questionable aspects of his empire were either legitimized or quietly dissolved. It had been expensive, complicated, and exhausting. But watching Dominic work with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once applied to criminal enterprises, now focused on building something legal and lasting, had filled Elena with a pride she hadn't expected to feel. "You're enjoying this," she'd observed one evening, finding him in his study surrounded by incorporation papers and business plans. "I'm enjoying building something that won't get raided by federal agents at 3 in the morning." He'd looked up, his smile tired but genuine. "And I'm enjoying knowing that when we get married, if we get married, you won't spend our wedding night wondering if your husband is about to be arrested." The casual mention of actual marriage had made Elena's breath catch. "Is that a proposal?" "Not yet. When I actually propose, it won't be buried in paperwork and exhaustion." He'd stood, moving around the desk to pull her into his arms. "It'll be memorable. Romantic. Everything you deserve." "I don't need romantic. I just need real." "You'll get both." He'd kissed her forehead. "But first, I need to make sure I can give you a future that doesn't include federal prison." The legitimate transformation had taken 3 months of intensive work. 3 months during which Elena had watched Dominic remake himself from crime lord to businessman, shedding the illegal aspects of his empire with the same precision he'd once used to build them. It hadn't been easy. Some associates had refused to go legitimate and had to be cut loose. Some ventures couldn't be saved and had to be dissolved, and Marcus Klein had watched every move with frustrated suspicion. But by the time autumn arrived, Dominic Varela's empire had been thoroughly cleaned and documented. The federal investigation had quietly closed for lack of evidence, and Elena had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with the man who'd chosen to change his entire world rather than risk losing her. The real proposal came on a Saturday afternoon in October. Elena had been in the garden with Lucas, who was now walking and getting into everything with the determined enthusiasm of a toddler. She'd been chasing him around the fountain, laughing at his squeals of delight, when she'd looked up to find Dominic watching them from the terrace. "How long have you been standing there?" she'd called out. "Long enough to realize something important." He'd walked down to meet them, scooping up Lucas when the toddler had run toward him with grabby hands. "Come with me, both of you." He'd led them to a part of the gardens Elena had never explored, a secluded area surrounded by rose bushes where a small table had been set up with champagne and juice boxes. Lucas's favorite teddy bear sat in a tiny chair, and scattered across the ground were rose petals in a pattern that took Elena a moment to recognize. They spelled out, "Marry me." Her heart had stopped, then started again at double speed. "Dominic, let me say this before I lose my nerve." He'd set Lucas down, letting the toddler toddle over to investigate his teddy bear, then had taken both of Elena's hands in his. "6 months ago, you walked into my life as a maid trying to disappear. You were broken and scared and convinced you'd never be safe again. And I offered you a deal because that's what I do. I make deals. I solve problems. I fix things with power and money." "I remember." "But you didn't just take the deal and hide behind my protection. You took that protection and used it to rebuild yourself. You went back to therapy. You started trusting again. You became the fierce, brilliant woman I see standing in front of me now." His voice had roughened with emotion. "And somewhere along the way, I fell completely in love with you." Elena's eyes had filled with tears. "Dominic, I know we started as an arrangement. I know this relationship was built on strategy and mutual need. But Elena, what I feel for you now has nothing to do with arrangements or protection or solving problems." He'd released one of her hands to pull a ring box from his pocket, not the emerald from before, but something new. "This is me, asking you to marry me for real. Not for protection or appearances or any other practical reason. Just because I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget how extraordinary you are." He'd opened the box to reveal a ring that had made her gasp, a delicate band with a diamond that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the garden. "It's smaller than the emerald," he'd said, suddenly uncertain. "But I wanted something that was just ours, not part of the performance." Elena had looked at this man who'd saved her, protected her, changed his entire life for her, and felt her heart overflow with more love than she'd known she was capable of feeling. "Yes," she'd whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, for real this time." When he'd kissed her, Lucas had squealed and clapped, and Elena had felt pieces of herself that she'd thought were permanently broken suddenly clicking back into place. Not the same as they'd been before Caleb, she'd never be that naive again. But something better, stronger, forged in fire and cooled in safety until she'd become someone who could stand beside a powerful man without losing herself. The wedding had been planned for the spring, giving them time to do it properly. But 2 weeks before the ceremony, Elena had gotten a call that had threatened to destroy everything they'd built. She'd been in the nursery, putting Lucas down for his nap, when her phone had rung with an unknown number. She'd almost ignored it, but something had made her answer. "Hello?" "Elena." The voice had been instantly, horribly familiar. "We need to talk." Her blood had turned to ice. "Caleb, don't hang up, please. Just listen for a minute." Every instinct had screamed at her to end the call, to run to Dominic, to activate every protection they'd built. But curiosity, and maybe the need to face this ghost one final time, had kept her on the line. "You have 1 minute." "I'm dying." The words had been flat, emotionless. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less." Elena's medical training had kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging what that meant even as her emotions reeled. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" "Because I wouldn't blame you for being relieved." A bitter laugh. "I'm not calling for sympathy, Elena. I'm calling to apologize." She'd sat down hard on the nursery floor, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "What?" "I've had a lot of time to think. About who I was, what I did to you, the way I tried to control you, hurt you, use our son to keep you trapped." His voice had been rough, broken. "I was a monster, and I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix what you did. I know, nothing fixes it, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. The abuse, the manipulation, all of it. I wanted to tell you that you were right to run, right to protect Lucas from me, right to choose Dominic over me." Elena had closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm dying, and I don't want to die without saying it. You deserved better than me. You always did. And Lucas," his voice had cracked. "Tell him his father was sorry he wasn't the man he should have been. Caleb? Be happy, Elena. That's all I want now. Just be happy with Dominic and give Lucas the life I couldn't give him. The life I was too broken to even try to give him." The call had ended, leaving Elena sitting on the nursery floor with her phone clutched in her trembling hand. She'd sat there until Dominic had found her, concern etched across his face. "Elena? What happened?" She'd told him everything, watching his expression shift from fury to something more complicated, pity, maybe, or understanding of what it meant to be broken by your own family's patterns. "Do you want to see him?" Dominic had asked finally. "I can arrange it. Security, neutral location, whatever you need." Elena had thought about it carefully. Did she want to see the man who'd nearly destroyed her, now that he was dying and apparently repentant? Did she need that closure? "No," she'd said finally. "I don't need to see him. I needed to hear him say he was sorry, to acknowledge what he did. But I don't need to give him anything more than that. My forgiveness, my time, my emotional energy, those belong to me now, not to him." Dominic had pulled her close, his arms strong and steady around her. "That's growth, love. Protecting yourself without guilt." "Do you think he meant it? The apology?" "I think dying has a way of making people see themselves clearly. Whether he meant it or not doesn't change what he did. But it might give him some peace, and that's not a bad thing." Elena had nodded against his chest, feeling the last chains of her past life finally breaking. Caleb's apology didn't erase his abuse, but it did release her from wondering if she'd been wrong about him, if she'd overreacted, if she'd destroyed a good man by leaving. He'd admitted he was the monster she'd known him to be, and now she could truly let him go. 2 months later, they'd received word that Caleb had passed away quietly in Singapore, his family at his bedside. Elena had felt surprisingly little. No grief, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter of her life was finally, permanently closed. The wedding took place on a perfect spring day in the mansion's gardens that had been transformed into something magical. White flowers everywhere, strings of lights waiting to illuminate the evening celebration, and 200 guests who'd come to witness Dominic Varela marry the woman who'd changed everything about him. Elena had stood in her suite, looking at herself in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, cream silk that flowed like water, with a neckline that showed the necklace Dominic had given her that morning, a delicate pendant that had belonged to his mother. "You look beautiful," Maria had said, adjusting Elena's veil with gentle hands. "Mr. Varela is a lucky man. I'm the lucky one. He gave me my life back." "You gave each other new lives. That's what real love does." The ceremony was intimate despite the crowd, focused entirely on the two people at the center. When Elena had walked down the aisle on Victor's arm, the closest thing she had to family now, she'd seen only Dominic waiting for her, his expression so full of love and pride that she'd had to blink back tears. The vows they'd written were simple but profound. Dominic had promised to protect without controlling, to support without diminishing, to love without conditions. Elena had promised to trust without fear, to stand beside him as an equal, to build a future that honored both their pasts without being defined by them. When the officiant had pronounced them married, Dominic's kiss had been tender and claiming all at once, a promise of the life they were beginning together. The reception had been everything a Varela event should be, elegant, lavish, filled with powerful people celebrating the union of two unlikely partners. But the moment Elena remembered most clearly came late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and only the closest friends remained. She'd been dancing with Dominic under the stars, the string lights creating a canopy of gold above them, when he'd pulled her close and whispered, "Thank you." For what? For trusting me when you had every reason not to. For seeing past what I was to what I could become. For loving me enough to demand I be better. Elena had looked up at him, this man who'd started as her dangerous salvation and become her genuine partner. "You saved me, Dominic, from Caleb, from fear, from losing myself completely. The least I could do was help you save yourself too. We saved each other. That's what makes this work." A year later, Elena stood in the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Varela Medical Center, a state-of-the-art facility in the heart of the neighborhood where Dominic's illegal clinic had once operated. She wore professional clothes now, a white coat over her dress, her name tag reading Dr. Elena Varela, Director of Neonatal Services. She'd gone back to nursing gradually, starting with volunteer work at Dominic's now legal medical centers, then slowly rebuilding her career until she'd felt ready to lead her own department. The fear of being recognized, of Caleb finding her, had faded with his death. Now she was reclaiming the career she'd loved, the skill she'd thought she'd lost forever. Dominic stood beside her, Lucas balanced on his hip. The toddler now called him Daddy, without hesitation or confusion. Watching them together, seeing Dominic's gentle patience with her son, Elena felt gratitude so profound it sometimes overwhelmed her. "Ready to cut the ribbon, Dr. Varela?" the mayor asked, smiling at her with genuine warmth. She'd looked at Dominic, who'd nodded encouragement, then at the building that represented everything they'd built together. Legitimate businesses, honest work, helping people without hiding in shadows. "Ready," she'd said, and cut the ribbon to applause from the assembled crowd. That evening, after Lucas was asleep and the celebration was over, Elena and Dominic sat on the terrace overlooking the gardens where they'd gotten engaged. She was curled against his side, his arm around her shoulders, both of them simply existing in the peaceful quiet. "Do you ever miss it?" Elena asked. "The old life? The danger and the power?" Dominic had considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, when problems could be solved with money or force. But then I look at what we have now. Lucas calling me daddy, you rebuilding your career, waking up every morning without wondering if today's the day the feds break down my door, and I don't miss it enough to want it back." No regrets? Only one. He'd shifted to look at her directly. "I regret that you had to go through hell with Caleb to end up here. I wish you could have found me through some other path, one that didn't require you to be broken first." Elena had smiled, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "But I wouldn't be who I am now without that path. The breaking taught me how strong I could be. Running taught me I could survive anything. And finding you taught me that strength and softness aren't opposites. They're partners." Poetic, Dr. Varela. Accurate, Mr. Varela. She'd kissed him softly. We found each other in the darkness and built something that belongs in the light. That's not a story I'd change, even if I could. They'd sat there as the stars came out, two people who'd started as an arrangement and become a love story, proof that sometimes the most strategic choice could lead to the most genuine happiness. 5 years later, Elena sat in the mansion's library, now expanded to include a whole section of medical texts and research materials. Lucas was 7 now, in second grade, and generally convinced his father could solve any problem in the universe. A daughter, Isabella, named for Dominic's mother, was 3 and currently terrorizing the household staff with her cheerful demands for tea parties and dragon stories. The mansion had changed over the years, becoming less of a fortress and more of a home. The security was still present, but less obvious. The walls still protected them, but felt less like barriers. Dominic's business empire had grown entirely legitimately. Real estate, medical supply companies, a chain of community health centers that provided care to underserved populations. Marcus Klein had moved on to other targets. His investigation into Dominic closed years ago for lack of evidence. The city's society pages had long since accepted Elena Varela as a power in her own right, respected doctor, advocate for children's health, partner to one of the city's most influential businessmen. But the moment Elena treasured most came every evening, when Dominic would come home from whatever meeting or deal he'd been managing, and his first stop would always be wherever she and the children were. He'd kiss her like he'd been away for years instead of hours, scoop up both kids for enthusiastic hugs, and then they'd have dinner as a family in the kitchen that had once belonged to the staff she'd hidden among. "Tell me about your day," he'd say, genuinely interested in the premature twin she'd helped stabilize or the new protocol she was developing. And she'd tell him, secure in the knowledge that this man saw her as an equal, as a partner, as someone whose work mattered as much as his own. At night, after the children were asleep, they'd lie in bed together and talk about everything and nothing, plans for expanding the medical centers, Lucas's upcoming science fair project, whether Isabella inherited Dominic's stubborn streak or Elena's. "She's definitely yours," Dominic would insist. "She has your determination and your complete disregard for being told something is impossible. And your charm and your ability to convince anyone to do what she wants." They'd laugh, comfortable in the life they'd built, in the family they'd created, in the love that had started as strategy and become unshakable truth. On their 5th anniversary, Dominic had given Elena a gift that had made her cry: the deed to the mansion, transferred entirely into her name. "What's this?" she'd asked, staring at the legal document. "Insurance, protection, a guarantee that no matter what happens to me, you and the children will always have this home, that you'll always be secure." He'd pulled her close. "I know you don't need my protection anymore. You're strong enough to protect yourself now, but I still want you to have it, just in case." Elena had looked up at him, this man who'd given her freedom, safety, love, and now permanent security, and had realized they'd come full circle. She'd started as his employee, become his arrangement, transformed into his wife, and now stood as his true equal, so equal that he could give her everything without either of them fearing it diminished the other. "I love you," she'd said simply, "for this, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible and helping me become visible again. I love you for demanding I become someone worthy of you, for making me want to be better, for showing me that power isn't about control, it's about choosing to protect without diminishing." They'd kiss then, soft and sweet and full of the promise of all the years still ahead. Standing in that library years later with medical journals spread around her and the sounds of her children playing in the garden drifting through the open windows, Elena thought about the terrified woman who'd scrubbed floors and hidden from her past. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd been briefly, someone who'd taught her important lessons, but not someone who defined her anymore. She was Dr. Elena Varela now, mother, wife, neonatal specialist, partner to a powerful man who'd learned that the greatest power was loving someone enough to let them be fully themselves. She'd started as a maid in a lion's den, certain she'd be devoured. Instead, she'd tamed the lion, not by making him less dangerous, but by showing him that strength and tenderness could coexist, that protection didn't require possession, that love was the most strategic choice of all. And in the process, she'd found herself again. Not the woman she'd been before Caleb, and not the broken woman who'd run from him. Someone new, someone stronger. Someone who'd learned that safety wasn't about hiding, but about standing in the light beside someone who'd helped you remember you deserved to be seen. The engagement party Dominic had mentioned in the beginning, the one meant to sell a lie, had happened years ago. But the real celebration was this: the ordinary moments of an extraordinary life built on honesty and mutual respect, and the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. Elena closed her medical journal and walked to the window, watching Dominic play with their children in the garden where he'd proposed. He looked up, catching her eye, and smiled. The genuine smile he saved only for her, the one that still made her heart skip. She smiled back, her hand resting over her heart where the fear used to live, feeling only warmth now. They'd started with a transaction and built a love story. They'd traded pretense for partnership and lies for truth. They'd chosen each other every single day, and in doing so, had created something neither of them could have built alone. Not a cage dressed up as protection, not an arrangement masquerading as love, but a real partnership, forged in fire and cooled in trust, strong enough to weather anything because it was built on the only foundation that mattered: truth, respect, and the revolutionary choice to stand beside each other as equals, no matter what the world threw at them. Elena Varela, once invisible, once broken, once terrified, now stood fully visible, fully healed, and fully loved, and she'd never felt safer in her entire life.